Good evening, everyone. This is Dawn. I'm an ASQ Toronto Section Secretary. I will be the moderator of this webinar. On behalf of ASQ Toronto Section, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar and invite you to join us for online learning opportunities via ASQ Toronto Section free webinars. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be available on ASQ Toronto website as well as ASQ Toronto YouTube channel. Please note that there will be 5 to 10 minutes time after the webinar session for questions and answers. Please post your questions on the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. You will be given 0.1 RU recertification unit for attending this webinar if you attend at least 40 minutes, as well as filling out the survey. The survey will be sent to you after the webinar session. The topic of this webinar is creating an innovation culture. One of the first questions people ask about innovation is, how do I create a culture of innovation? The real question is, how can I get creativity to coexist with an execution culture? This webinar will give you the answers to that question and show the essential behaviors and organization structure you need for innovation. The learning objectives are the primary behaviors in an innovation culture, the differences between creative and execution behaviors, how a creative and an execution culture can coexist. I'd like to welcome our presenter tonight, Peter Merrill. Thank you, Peter, for accepting to be our speaker. Peter Merrill is a keynote speaker on innovation and has keynoted at conferences in cities such as Dubai, Mumbai, and Shanghai. He has spoken in Prague, London, and Helsinki. He began his career in R&D working on projects such as desalination and acrylics for carbon fiber. Later, as chief executive of one of the leading design brands in Europe, he led innovation in one of the most demanding markets. He is an engineer, an artist, and a writer, and has led innovation in the fields of both graphic arts and engineering. He currently chairs the Canadian National Committee to ISO TC 279, the Technical Committee on Innovation Management, and also chairs the ASQ Innovation Think Tank. He's the author of the books Innovation Generation, Innovation Never Stops, The Executive Guide to Innovation, and Do It Right the Second Time. He writes the innovation column for Quality Progress. Now I'd like to hand you over to our speaker, Peter Merrill. Peter, please take it away.
Dawn, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is just give you a basic understanding of what innovation actually is and why it's become so very important. In fact, first of all, I'm going to address that second question of why it's become so important. If you look at the world around us, it is changing at a most incredible rate. The marketplace is changing as Asia becomes a significant force. Technology is driving change as we go through digitization, and those changes in technology are leading to changes in our demographics as our population gets older. But unfortunately, there's also a downside to this, as we see our environment warming very much as the result of the, let me call it, technological changes of the last couple of centuries. So we're in a very changing environment, and I'm going to give you a quote from Charles Darwin. It is simply that it's not the strongest that will survive, nor the most intelligent of the species, but the one most responsive to change. And so the reason why innovation has become so very important is that it is the way we respond to change, by innovating. And the innovation process is essentially the conversion of new knowledge into new products and new services. So the fuel of innovation is knowledge. And that takes us into, where do we get new knowledge? Well, if you look at the field of knowledge management, what you find is that knowledge, the majority of it, is buried deep down inside us. Back in the 90s, people used to think that it was possible to document all of the knowledge in an organization, and we've learned actually it's quite the reverse. What tends to happen if you document too much is it slows an organization down, it becomes too bureaucratic, and it comes to a halt. In fact, that what we call explicit or documented knowledge is typically less than 20% of the knowledge in our organization. 80% of it is what we call tacit knowledge, the knowledge in our minds, in other words, what we know that we know, and then the subconscious knowledge, which is even more, and that's deep down inside us, and we don't necessarily know immediately that we know that knowledge. So what that's led to in the field of innovation is the understanding that we've got to release that tacit and subconscious knowledge, and we found that that comes best through what we call creative behaviors. And I'm going to come to that in a moment. But before I do that, I want to explain that creativity is not the whole story. There is also what we call execution behavior that's necessary for successful innovation. And if you look at the innovation process, it starts off in the creative phase where we find opportunities and where we find concept solutions, but that's only a part of the story. In fact, work at Bombardier has shown that that's probably only 20% of the total budget. The real work is down here with the development and delivery of the solution, the execution phase where we put ideas into practice and where that requires a very results-oriented type of person. So those people are first of all in the creative phase the people who are good at finding opportunities. We call them creators because they start the process. Then the people who are good at finding concept solutions we call connectors. We call them that because they connect with ideas that may be outside of the present environment. They connect with other industries. They see concepts, fundamental knowledge, and they convert them into the environment in which the business is operating. And we find typically in the world of quality, connectors are very much in a predominance. Ironically, in the world generally, they're very much a minority. Then the third stage is what we call the developers. These are the people who are good at taking an idea and making it work. They create user-friendly solutions. That's the section I happen to fall into. I'm not very good at finding original ideas, but I am good at taking that idea and making it practical and making it work. And the last step is the doers, the people who deliver the solution. And they're every bit as important as the creators who start the process. So what you're starting to see is that innovation is a team sport, and we need many different types of people. In order to find out what type of a person you are in the innovation process, there is actually a self-assessment available on our website, the petermerrill.com website, and if you go to the self-assessment, you'll find by answering these questions, you just go a row at a time, and you pick out which is most like you and score 4 points, which is least like you and score 1 point, and gradually work down the rows, total up your final score, and it tells you whether you're a connector, a doer, a creator, or a developer. I'm not going to do that now. I'll leave you to do it after this session. But I think you'll find it very useful. It's a good bit of self-discovery. And if you do it with your team, the people you work with, and by the way, it's complimentary. You just go on the website and do it, and it'll tell you what kind of a person you are. You do it with your team, you can get a much better understanding of each other. You'll find there's a PDF that you can download that gives you a very detailed explanation. But let me give you a kind of summary explanation of these different types of people. First of all, the creators. They're the people who see the need out there. And we may not always see that opportunity. Needs are opportunities. The people who are good at this tend to find their career in market research and areas like that. And they're very open-minded, but very practical people. They work best with what is called an open network. They work with people who know people who know people. And they operate best in a loose mode, no boundaries. This kind of environment allows their subconscious to work, allows them to come up with new opportunities. It's important to separate the word opportunity from the word solution, and as quality professionals, you understand that. The solution will only come after you've defined the problem. Where people often go wrong in the world of innovation is they mix this opportunity and solution together. They're two separate steps. Having found the opportunity, you define it, and then you start connecting to the solution. People who are good at this are people working in design, people working in R&D, certainly people working in quality. The difference between connectors and the creators, connectors are much more thinking kind of people. But they do still need an open network. They find solutions through collective knowledge by interacting with other people. And again, they operate well in a loose mode in that open network. An important rule for the connector is to not stop at the first answer, but keep generating new solutions. The physicist Linus Pauling said, the best way to get a good idea is to get lots of ideas. Because what you do is you get all the ideas you can, and then you evaluate them. You find out which has got the best return on investment, the lowest risk attached to solutioning, and so on. You find the best, most practical solution for your business, the least able to be copied by other businesses. In other words, you perhaps got unique competencies for a particular solution. And then you move on to developing. The developers are the people who create a user-friendly solution. Engineers, systems people. These, like the connectors, are thinkers as well. But they operate in a different environment. They work in a closed network and tightly. Their job is to get the result, make the solution work. And where developers often go wrong is two areas. First of all, they love the blue skying that the connectors did, and they start thinking up new solutions, and they start putting complexity into the solution instead of simplicity. That's something the developer has to look out for. And then finally, the doers. These are the people who deliver the solution. They're the sales, production, customer service people. Again, very practical people like the creators, but like the developers, they work best with a closed network. They work, again, in a tight mode. So what you've seen is that you need a mix of people for successful innovation. It is very much a team sport. So let me explain those two types of networks that I just touched on there. First of all, the creative network. This is what people finding opportunities or finding concept solutions need to have around them. People finding opportunities will, you heard me say a moment ago, know people who know people who know people. They know where to go out exploring and finding new ideas. They are good at mixing with people in other disciplines. People who are not even yet customers, mixing with business partners. And that kind of behavior is good for finding opportunities, but it's also the right behavior for finding concept solutions. Because if we share collective knowledge, that's how we grow our knowledge and find more and more conceptual solutions. Typically, we want to have at least 2 degrees of separation in our network, both for finding opportunities and for finding conceptual solutions. Then the closed network, or execution network, is quite different. What's interesting, though, is that if you've got an open network, as people get to know each other, it actually morphs into a closed network. A closed network has a much higher level of trust. People know each other well. They feel much more comfortable collaborating with each other. This kind of closed network forms quite easily. And the reason why is that we tend to be attracted to people similar to ourselves. It's called the mirror effect. And so a closed network, while it's easy to form, is not what we would want in the earlier creative kind of phase. And so bear in mind, we've got to find a way in which these two networks can coexist in our organization. But let me take you a little deeper into creativity first before I go into organization structure. A creative culture is one that produces new ideas through imagination and through unconventional, unusual approaches. In Disney, they call it Imagineering. And that occurs when we've got freedom to think. That's that open network. When we interact with new stimuli, that happens in an open network when we can explore. Unfortunately, in our modern business world, a lot of that opportunity has been taken away from us by the daily work we do. We work in a box, in a cubicle. We have lunch in a box. We don't go to a cafeteria anymore. We think in a box. And so that's why creativity has often been shrunk in organizations, and where we now recognize we've got to reinstall creativity or allow creativity, because it is a natural thing for all of us. And so the creative behaviors that we want to encourage are exploration, first of all. You hear that expression, step out of the box. Go and find new opportunities. Collaboration, where we can mix with people who are very different from ourselves, and where collectively we can find new solutions. And once we've found potential solutions, we're willing to try them out. We're willing to fail. Creativity requires that overcoming that risk aversion that we've tended to build into our business cultures. Let me explain these three behaviors in a bit more detail. Exploration, first of all. Stepping out of the box, going places, meeting people, and networking face-to-face. We've unfortunately started to regress into a virtual world. And we haven't got virtual reality yet. So people spend a large slice of their time face into their phone. And one of the things that research is finding is that depression in millennials is becoming a serious factor simply because of spending so much time staring at the phone. We need to have a more open mind. We need to be able to get out and mix with real people, find out what their issues are. We don't ask people, what do you need? We ask them, what's bugging you? What are your problems? That's how we get new ideas and new opportunities. And these things are not forced. It takes time. But we're always learning. We're always looking. Then interaction and collaboration is where we find that by mixing with people different from ourselves, we get those breakthroughs. Breakthroughs come at intersections of bodies of knowledge. And it's the old think tank concept. And that's 60, 70 years old, that idea. We've kind of gotten away from it. We tend to put people into boxes of similar types. By mixing, by being diverse, we give people that essential jolt and release that collective subconscious. Now, when you're working with diverse people, it's important to understand those other people. As Stephen Covey said in his book, 7 Habits, seek to understand before you seek to understand and to be understood. And recognize that relationships take time. One of the classic relationships in history were the two writers, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And of course, you're familiar with the books they wrote. They were made into movies, Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia. And when you look at those books, they're very, very similar. The reason, that's quite simple. These two guys, they were both at Oxford University in the UK. Every Tuesday evening, they used to meet in a pub in Oxford and talk to each other. And they freely shared ideas. And that's an important part of collaboration, not being afraid to share and give and take both ways. That's how you get that magic spark of interaction between diverse parties. So then we've got a potential solution, and this is where we try it out. We try things with our partners. We don't do it necessarily in isolation, because if you've got a potential new idea, your business partner is probably going to be a critical component. You try things out and you learn. You're willing to embrace failure. A good example of celebrating failure is the product WD-40. It's still around from having been originally invented in 1953, would you believe? A guy called Norm Larson in California, he'd been through 39 previous tests of product until he came to water deterrent number 40. That's WD-40. It's still around to this day. We know if you live in a damp climate, you carry it in your car to spray on the engine on a damp morning. So being willing to capture those lessons learned is vital. Too often people run away from failure, whereas in fact they're actually great sources of knowledge. And vitally in the world of innovation, you're always learning in order to find new solutions. And I'm going to give you a quote from a book from many years ago, Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline. He quoted a person called Airy de Goose from Royal Dutch Shell, who said that the only competitive edge an organization has is the ability to learn faster than the competition. If you're going to learn, you're going to have to fail as well, but learn from that failure. So in order to find solutions, these are the essential components. You need people who know the problem, what exactly it is, it needs to be defined. You need a mix of people so that you've got many different types together. You need disruption. I hate disruptors. You probably do as well. They're the people we don't want on the team, but they're so necessary. They're what challenge the status quo. A good way of getting diversity is also including your customers and your suppliers and having a real mix of disciplines to spark that genius. And a great illustration of how important diversity is in problem solving comes from some work done in the California Institute of Technology. Professor Scott Page did some work there in which he was testing the ability of Mensa high IQ people to solve problems. He'd got a group of Mensa people. He'd got a series of problems he wanted them to solve. And he needed to calibrate them against a control set. He went into the cafeteria, found a group of guys, just ordinary everyday guys. They're all different. He called them the brown socks guys. And he matched the two groups, the Mensa people and the brown socks people. And he started these series of problem solvings. He was shocked. The brown socks guys beat the Mensa guys every time. And he couldn't understand it. And as he looked deeper, he realized that it was because the collective knowledge of the brown socks guys, the ordinary guys, was actually greater than the knowledge of the Mensa guys, all of whom had the same knowledge as it happened because he'd picked the Mensa people from the same background. And so it was living proof that collective knowledge is so very powerful. And the creative process that we use assuming you've got your group of diverse people, starts off with a clear problem definition. And there are many different problem-solving methodologies. Creative problem-solving is what I'm talking about here. But they've got a common pattern. The first thing is you get people to write down their own ideas. People will usually think of 2, 3, at the most 4 ideas as possible solutions to a problem. But this is when the various problem-solving, creative problem-solving methods vary. They all have different methods of circulating and stimulating to create randomness. It's important to have people writing their own ideas first, because that eliminates some loud voice of saying that won't work. It also allows people to be wild in their ideas. They won't be on their own, but once they talk to their partner, someone else in the group, they'll start to generate more thoughts. And then they switch to another partner and generate even more thoughts. There are many, many different methodologies, and a good book for finding those different methodologies called Cracking Creativity. Some of the techniques, brain writing's one, clustering's another. Clustering's been around for a century. Stravinsky wrote his ballets through the technique of clustering. Look around, find different methods, and it's important in your company to use different methods, not just one method of creative problem solving. And you don't do creative problem solving once a year, you're doing it continuously. So what I've described up till now is the creative phase of innovation. It's the loose phase, the finding the opportunity, the finding the solution. We've now arrived at the tipping point where we need to decide which is our best potential solution. You probably won't just pick one. You'll probably pick a couple or even 3 because you won't be absolute on which is your best opportunity. You're dealing with uncertainty, and a key skill in the world of innovation is managing uncertainty. So you pick 2 or 3 alternatives. You've done your risk assessment, time, cost, and risk, and you now go into development. You go deeper. And what's important at this point also is that you have criteria in place which tell you when you are going to kill an opportunity. That's hard, very hard. And where people often go wrong is they stay too long with too many alternative solutions. But in the development and delivery or execution phase, step 3 and step 4, we change our behavior. A very different kind of culture is now what we're going into. I spent quite a bit of time describing creativity, so you've got a good feel for it. You feel what it's like. I now want to try and give you the feel of what execution is like. And an execution culture is highly focused. We've picked our solution, we've narrowed our focus, and we need a very tight team. It's that closed network. We want a very lean process. This is starting to sound familiar, isn't it? It's a quality management process that we're looking at for delivery. And so we focus, we move with speed. I prefer speed to secrecy. Someone out there almost certainly is chasing the same opportunity as you are. So speed matters. That doesn't mean to say you don't protect your intellectual property, but you've got to move fast and you've got to be disciplined. Good project management. But here's a caution. Retain some of that creativity. You need some of those people who came up with those original opportunities and ideas just to remind the developers and the deliverers what started this off. Some very chilling statistics as well. For 3,000 original ideas, only 1 makes it. So this is why Thomas Edison said famously, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So the kind of behaviors we see now in the execution of ideas is, first of all, the mission. which is to create a user-friendly solution and then to deliver that solution. It is not the mission to add bells and whistles, and that's where developers so often go wrong. They get all these additional cool ideas which slow things down and make the solution harder to use. You find this classically in software development, but you're increasingly finding that in all sorts of offerings. Cars are becoming more and more complicated and less intuitive in the way they're used. The danger here is that developers love the blue sky of the thinker in the connector step. They like to stay loose instead of getting into high focus. Now, speed and discipline and a high work ethic are absolutely critical to deliver the solution. So we need good project management with very tight monitoring and very tight control on the process. I hope you're now starting to get a different feel for the behaviors that we're looking at. And then in the delivery, and I've said it already, your quality management system is what delivers. Leadership throughout both the development and the delivery stage have to monitor very closely the change in behavior, making sure that people are no longer blue skying, but they've got their eye on the prize, they're aiming at the goal. There need to be regular reviews of progress, make sure that we're not falling behind. When I worked in R&D, we didn't actually have monthly or quarter, we had bi-monthly reviews. That was what my company preferred, and they were absolutely critical. They drove progress because you didn't want to go into, and I mean, I was a young engineer then, but the last thing you wanted to do was to go into the meeting 8 weeks after the last meeting and no progress. You were determined to get results. A month was too short, a quarter was too long. That's why we chose bi-monthly. Now, another thing that should be happening in this execution phase is that the people in your group should change. You should have much more operations and salespeople now by the time you're ready to deliver. And the other thing that should be constantly monitored is the risk and the return on investment. So you're constantly through both development and the delivery phase, adjusting your plan, keeping your eye on the numbers all the time. So how do we get this creativity which I've described, which is so much fun? It's the blue sky, the freedom, the excitement. How do we get that to coexist with execution, which is so focused on the goal? One of the major challenges that organizations have in getting these two things to coexist is organization structure. And the reason is this, and you see it with startup businesses. They start off very agile, they get successful, they grow, but as they grow, they become less agile. So we need the coexistence of agility for creativity and focus for delivery. Structure is the issue, and I'm going to share with you a concept that I developed many years ago in terms of the optimum size of a business unit. There's nothing clever about this, and if you think back to your own personal experience, it bears this out. You know that the optimum size for communication in a group is around about 6 people. We've known that for thousands of years. And if you look at any organization, scout patrols were 6 people. If you look at a sports team, you might have 11 or 12 people in the team, but they break into 2 halves. The natural operating unit is 6 people. The natural depth of communication is 3 layers. If you get to 4 layers, organizations really struggle in their communications. So if you take an average of 6 people across the organization as a communication span, some will be 3, some will be 8, and so on, but an average of 6, and take 3 layers, I know this sounds a bit nerdy, but it actually works out at 259 people in the organization. My point is that once you get over about 300 people, you get into communication problems. And I know your experience will have borne that out. And you see organizations becoming less and less agile as they go over that size. What happens in practice, even if we don't manage it this way, organizations split like an amoeba. They have a natural operating size for a business unit. So how do we deal with this? Well, different ways, different organizations. There are many, many different ways that have been used to address the agility that's needed in creativity. First of all, we know that hierarchy has to be stopped. That's the three-layer thing. But we also want to allow diversity and relative independence. So very often, companies spin off their creative new business unit. There's a few things we learn about doing that that really matter. If you are going to spin off your new business opportunity into a separate business unit, the leader of that spin-off needs to report to a higher level than usual in the parent organization. There's a great case study in Corning Glass where this happened. They learned how company politics will often get in the way of an innovation. Because if you're interested in introducing something new, somebody who's dealing with the status quo is going to lose out, and they want to protect themselves. And they're often well established in the organization. So you overcome that politics by having a leader of a spin-off report to a higher level. Another thing we've learned about the spin-off approach is that because it's dealing with new knowledge and new behaviors, you have a separate IT and HR function. IT is dealing with knowledge, HR is dealing with behavior and culture. If you retain the old IT and HR, you will smother the spin-off. And there are good examples out in the world of people who've spun off organizations. Procter & Gamble, under their CEO, A.G. Lafley, back 15 years ago, were totally stagnant. And Lafley said, okay, we're going to spin off our creativity. And he literally went to another company called Innocentive, which is an R&D company, and got them to do the creative design work. And it was very successful. And it worked for quite a while, but it eventually faded. Lafley left. And what's interesting was they called him back to see if he could reinstate that, but it was a short-term fix. Lockheed Martin, going way back before Procter & Gamble, back in World War II, did a similar thing. They created what they called the Skunk Works. That's this separate organization. And the term Skunk Works really was used, it was a bit of a nickname because they all said that the spin-off had a bad smell about it, and that's why it had been spun off. The problem with the spin-off is communication. You are separating your creative business from your core business, and that can lead to all sorts of issues. One of the best solutions that's been found for getting creativity and execution to coexist is the company W.L. Gore. You may not have heard of it, but you've heard of their product, Gore-Tex. If you're an outdoor person, you'll know Gore-Tex. Bill Gore started his company. He's no longer with us, but back, would you believe, in the 1950s. It is now a multi-billion corporation. It doesn't seek fame. It certainly achieves fortune, that's for sure, very successful. And one of the principles Bill Gore instilled from the get-go was that he was going to have a flat organization with business units of 150 to 200 persons. Does that sound familiar after the slide I showed you a couple of slides back? He was not going to have a corporate tower. He was going to have a campus of buildings. I worked in this kind of environment when I worked with Phil Crosby some years back. He went for exactly the same structure as Bill Gore. And what Bill Gore initiated was something we take very much for granted today, the concept of self-managed teams. Teams of 8 to 12 people, but a very flat organization. So a bit more than the 6 that I gave you earlier, but often just a 2-layer organization. And he would have sales and R&D in the same team. What Bill Gore invested in, though, very heavily was culture development. He, whenever somebody new joined the company, invested really heavily in engaging that person into that company. And, you know, when I first went into R&D, the company I chose to work with was a big corporation, but they did that same thing. They really invested in making sure that the people they recruited would fit in the company. It wasn't about money and technical ability, it was about culture. And unfortunately, in company structures, we too often separate sales from R&D. Sales are the talkers, R&D are the thinkers. They seem so different. And yet, that's the diversity we want for finding unique solutions. A third method, and there are others, is shifting your team membership as you move through a project. As you start a project, you have a lot of creators and connectors, very few developers and doers. And as you move through the project, you get into connecting to the solution, so you've got more connectors. Then developers make it user-friendly. And we get to market with majority being doers, similar number of developers, but still retaining some creators and connectors. That shifting approach is something that one should do subtly, but in a very well-managed kind of way. So good companies structure looseness into their organization structure. They allow it into the organization. They allow this wisdom of crowds. And if you look at companies that have done this well, Google, allowing a day a week for wild ideas. You notice I put some question marks in there. Google, a couple of years ago, were under enormous pressure from shareholders who didn't see this day a week, as being immediately profitable. And that's one of the challenges when you're a creative business. People looking for short-term solutions won't necessarily support you. But companies who have sustained that approach are well known. Hewlett-Packard does a very, very similar thing. 3M, they do a very, very similar thing. In other words, they discipline time to be undisciplined time, if you understand what I'm saying there. They allow that group genius and practice it regularly. So, how do we begin? What do we do? These are the first steps in a change map that I use a lot. You start off looking at your organization and do an assessment of your culture. Then you create a sense of urgency. It's called a burning platform sometimes. Then you need a change team. And the challenge for the change team is to find an early win, to find an innovation which can be achieved relatively quickly, and then build that new offering into the business so it becomes business as usual. Those are some of the early steps of change management when you want to build an innovation culture. And so let me summarize what I've taken you through this evening. My 40 minutes are just up now, so I'll pull it all together. Your path forward, you can do a cultural assessment of your organization if you want to. We have this on our website, and if you want to conduct that assessment, you can do it either on your own, if you just want to try it out, but it's much better if you do it with a team of your people. And I would suggest a minimum of 5, and that way you get a consensus. So a cultural assessment is the first step in that change model that I showed you a moment ago, the cultural assessment down here. From that cultural assessment, you identify your issues. what are the aspects of our business where we are weak? Now, the change itself will come through operating a process. You develop a project plan and you execute a project. That's how you will change your behaviors. So I've kind of sprinted the marathon. This is not something you will do in 48 hours. It's probably going to take a couple of years, typically, for a culture change. That's what most people would anticipate. And again, if you're interested in starting off with the culture assessment, just send me an email and I'll be happy to set it up for you. Okay, Dawn, back to you.
Thank you very much again, Peter, for your presentation. Please post your questions on the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. And I should remind that you can find a recording of this webinar on ASQ Toronto section website as well as ASQ Toronto YouTube channel. We have 5 to 10 minutes time for questions and answers, and you can post your questions on the Q&A section of the WebEx tool. I can see some questions have been posted. So the first question is with respect to your comment that millennials should stop communicating electronically and communicate with real people. Can you clarify?
Yeah. I'm not saying they should stop communicating electronically. That's part of life. We all do that. I'm very careful about social media. I do not use Facebook. I really do not, because I find it very invasive. I've stopped using it many years ago. I do use LinkedIn, though. I feel much safer with that. But the real issue is about relying entirely on the phone and having one's face buried in the phone. You see some pretty sad things. You go to a restaurant, you see a couple out at a table for their evening out, and instead of talking to each other, they're talking to their phones. I find that very sad. What research has shown is that the millennial age group has a greater tendency to live by the phone for communication. And there's some interesting evidence. If you ever read the book Lean Startup, there's a case study in there about a new video game that was launched. Lean Startup is about innovation, about how to start up an innovative business. A company had come up with a new video game. They decided to test it out. What they discovered when they tested this game, which was aimed at millennials, by the way, was that the #1 need in the group was to make friends. That was absolutely an imperative. Other research has shown that certainly depression rates are quite a bit higher in the millennial age group, and that's very much attributed to the lack of personal interaction. And of course, we're all familiar with the cyberbullying issue and so forth. I'm not saying don't do it. What I'm saying is it's a question of balance. Real personal interaction has a much higher bandwidth than electronic interaction. And you've only got to go to a conference and you see that, the amount of information and the excitement. Hopefully that answers the question, and I hope I didn't give a wrong impression when I was throwing that line out earlier. Next question, Dawn.
Yes, thank you, Peter. The next question is, would you kindly elaborate more on the assessment technique? Would that be Denison model?
I'm sorry, would I elaborate on the?
On the assessment technique.
Oh, the cultural assessment. Okay, yes. Yeah. What it looks like is it's actually 9 sections. I won't be able to remember the title of each section, but it starts off with exploration, and then it goes into collaboration, then it goes into ideation, and then experimentation all the way through. And in each section, there are 5 questions. I think it's 5 or 6 questions. 6 questions, sorry, because there's 54 in total. It sounds a lot, but actually as you work through it, you find it probably takes about 15 minutes or something like that to work through it. And what it does is it highlights for you which aspects of the innovation culture you need to work on. Is it exploration? Is it ideation? And so on. Does that, hopefully that gives an indication of what that assessment looks like.
Thank you. The next question is, who do you think should lead these changes, quality or HR?
Yeah, very good question. It's funny on television, when I see people say that, very good question, I usually say to myself, oh, he hasn't got an answer to that. I'm going to actually use another phrase, it depends. It depends very much on the role of quality and the role of HR in a given organization. My daughter is an HR professional, and in her company, and it's a fairly large corporation, the HR people have a true HR role, which is the development of culture. You don't always come across that. Unless the HR people have got a cultural responsibility, I wouldn't give this to them. So that leaves us with the quality profession. And as people in the quality profession know, quality and innovation are brother and sister. They work incredibly close together. We have, in the innovation division, we have a tagline, innovation is quality for tomorrow. In other words, innovation is about finding out the requirements of tomorrow's customer, and we may not yet even know who that customer is. So unless you've got a human resource function that has got a very definite cultural responsibility, I would say you're more likely to have success by increasing the scope of the quality function. Ideally, the two probably need to partner together in reality. Quality people are good at process, which clearly matters. Human resource people are good at behavior, which obviously is another key aspect of culture. Okay, Dawn, back to you.
Thank you, Peter. There are more questions that have been posted. The next question is, innovation culture seems to bloom and then fade as the original champions move on. How can we ensure sustainment? Is it truly possible?
I think sustainment of, well, first of all, culture change and then maintaining the culture is from having a good change management process. And it's like conducting a revolution. You have a revolution, then there's a counter-revolution, and there's often chaos. I think the issue of sustaining a culture can vary so much from company to company because it depends very much on what the issues are in terms of the thing blowing hot and cold. Can I ask you, Dawn, just to read me back that question one more time so I can get, there was a specific in there that I may have missed.
Sure. Innovation culture seems to bloom and then fade as the original champions move on. How can we ensure sustainment? Is it truly possible?
Okay, good. I'd missed the thing about champions. I knew there was something in there. Clearly, what we need to deal with is good succession planning. And if you look at the sustainment of ASQ over the years, that's one thing that we've always invested in, good succession planning. And not having the same person doing it for too long because you get burnout, but also coaching new people up to be champions. And so rotating, and in larger organizations, they generally keep a person in a job for a couple of years. A year in which to find out about it, and a year in which to get results, and maybe a third year, but rarely more than that. So I would say the short answer to that question is good succession planning, so that you're not running short of a champion, and you're constantly coaching new people up into leadership roles. Understanding what innovation is about, understanding the cultural issues. Okay, Dawn, back to you.
Thank you, Peter. Next question is how we implement the creativity at lower level of the organization.
Well, it's actually not that difficult. What we've typically done is inhibit creativity at lower levels. It's there, but we actually stop people being creative. We tend to treat people like machines. I have very strong feelings about this. The Industrial Revolution came up with machines which were not quite capable, and so we put people in to deal with the machine deficiencies. I think back to one of my very first summer jobs when I was still at school, and I worked in a bakery, and 7 o'clock in the morning, my job was to stand at the end of a conveyor belt and lift the Vienna rolls off one conveyor belt and put them on another conveyor belt. And I always remember one morning I was stood there and I heard this shout suddenly, and I actually gone to sleep standing up. And all around my feet were these Vienna rolls that had come off the first conveyor belt. I mean, what better way to start a strike or start a revolution? Unfortunately, we tend to treat people like that in the manufacturing world, and there's nothing more guaranteed to dumb down their creativity. You know, by the end of that summer, I was incapable of reading a newspaper. It was devastating. So the answer is actually to allow creativity and to give people space. Allow them time and space to allow their minds and not treat them like adjuncts to machines. So you can tell a bit of passion for me on that. It's something I feel very strongly about.
Thank you. To answer the next question, you can find the recording of this webinar on ASQ Toronto section website, which is www.asqtoronto.org, as well as ASQ Toronto YouTube channel. The next question is, how does one even start innovating in a company where the highest level CEO or president doesn't seem the need to innovate when they are entered in the belief that their products and processes are reflectively fine as they are and do not want innovation?
Yeah, well, I would start looking around. If you want to be in a world of innovation and you've got leadership who are thinking like that, you're unlikely to change that. What classically is done, though, is going back to the change model, you create a burning platform. You create evidence that products will die. You show the maturity of a product. You show the declining margin of the product. And that is how you make a case for new products. But quite frankly, if one is a believer in innovation and you've got leaders thinking that way, I wouldn't hang around. I really wouldn't. I'm sorry to be so blunt about that, but innovation is a team sport, and the captain of the team clearly has to believe in innovation for the team as a whole.
Thank you, Peter. The next question is, what do you think about many offices now moving to open concept offices? I do not like them as I have a hard time to focus. When you talk about open, would you include these type of facility designs?
Yeah, I totally agree with this questioner. I totally dislike open offices. I need quietness. I need focus. That's because I'm a developer. I'm a highly focused person. I cannot work when there's no noise around me. And, you know, I get a bad reputation in public places. I've actually gone and told people to shut up because they're getting in my way. And I get really angry in public places when people are on their phone. Again, I've gone and told people to go somewhere else if they want to, you know, carry out a loud phone conversation. But taking that into the work environment, I completely agree that the open office space, when you are doing individual activities, or when you are doing activity that requires intense thinking, particularly if you are dealing with detailed data, analyzing data, the open office is highly disruptive and really, for me anyway, wrecks my ability to think. At the same time, if you want, what should we say, collective knowledge, you don't do it in an open office. You bring people together in an environment where they are working collectively and not shouting across an office. I agree totally with the questioner on this one.
Thank you. The last question is, if as a result of assessment we find out there is a big gap in people behavior, how should we manage this situation since cultural improvement takes lots of time and effort, and normally organizational improvement plans are limited to a defined schedule?
Okay, there's a few parts to that question. So I will ask you to repeat it after I've addressed the first part. You find a gap as a result of the assessment, and that gap will relate to a stage in the innovation process. And so what you do is you engage in the process, and when you get to the step where the gap exists, say it's in creative problem solving or ideation, you clearly invest in that step in the process. And so you develop your culture by strengthening your process. That's the short answer to that when you find a gap. Now, there were other things in that question, Dawn, so I'm going to come back to you and ask you to just repeat the question again.
So the question is, if as a result of assessment we find out there is a big gap in people behavior, how should we manage this situation since cultural improvement takes lots of time and effort, and normally organizational improvement plans are limited to a defined schedule?
It was the last few words that I couldn't get. That's why I didn't get them the first time. It was the few words before organizational improvement. What were and then to the end of the question. Could you repeat those?
Sure.
Not the whole.
How should we manage this situation since cultural improvement takes lots of time and effort, and normally organizational improvement plans are limited to a defined schedule?
Okay, so I have to assume that the reference to organizational improvement is actually referring to process improvement. And it's a question of aligning the two. And it's about deciding which steps in your process are not working effectively and the related culture weaknesses. And I would deal with both at the same time. I'm not sure I've given a very satisfactory answer to that because it is quite a complex question. But I come back to my point. You deal with culture change by addressing the process at the steps where the culture is weak and encouraging behavior in that area. I used the example of ideation earlier. If you find that your exploration step in the process is not working. Clearly, you focus on that process and you develop the behaviors which go with that process, with that step in the process. So it's about competency development as well as behavior. I think that's about as good as I'm going to get on that one at this point, Dawn. And I think we're out of time as well.
Yes. Thank you very much again, Peter, for your presentation and answering all these questions. And thank you all again for joining this webinar, and have a good night. Goodbye.